Good morning, everyone. This is Amy Lemley with John Burton Advocates for Youth, and welcome to this morning's web seminar, SB 1083 and AB 2183, New Legislation to Improve California's Continuum of Care Reform. We're right on 10 o'clock, and I think we're going to pause just for a minute or so to give people a chance to join the webinar. But thank you very much for those of you who are on at this time, and we'll start in about a minute. All right, let's get started. Again, thank you for being here. We're going to have a great conversation today about two really exciting pieces of legislation, SB 1083 and AB 2183. And this web seminar today is organized by the four co-sponsors of the legislation, the Alliance for Children's Rights, the Children's Law Center of California, Children Now, and John Burton Advocates for Youth. So again, thank you for being here. Before we get started, we'll just take a moment to make sure everyone is able to connect and you can know where to find the web seminar after it's been posted. In case you can see the screen but not get the audio, you've got the call-in number right there. Secondly, we really encourage you to submit questions live as you have them. If you're like me, sometimes it's hard to remember them at the end during the formal Q&A. So we're here moderating and culling through those and making sure that your questions or ideas are answered, because that's really the purpose of the day, not just to give you information, but also to hear from you about if you think this is effective, if we could go farther with it, and really just to get your feedback. All the presentation materials are going to be posted on our website. They'll also be on the Alliance website, Children Now, and CLC's website as well. Only ours is listed there, but we'll make sure everyone has access to that. And then you can also have access to any handouts that we refer to in the presentation when we follow up with a email to all of the registrants for today's presentation. So what we're going to do is do some brief introductions and then jump right in to give some background on Continuum of Care Reform. It's an acronym that simply won't go away. Who knew 4 or 5 years ago when we launched into this effort that it was going to be such a dominant force in child welfare in California. So really step back, offer some background on that, and specifically the family resource approval process, because those are really the focus of this legislation. We're going to talk about some issues with RFA that have surfaced, and then really delve into what these fixes are, trying to take the intention of CCR and have it actually live up to that potential. Because it certainly has a lot of potential, and how can we ensure that the promise of CCR matches with the reality of CCR, which is, I think, what everyone wants. Then we're going to close out the conversation with how you can get involved, whether you're a caregiver, social worker, probation officer, lawyer, young person, public official. There's a role for everyone in pushing this effort forward, and we really do need that. And then we'll also have questions and answers. And so joining us on the web seminar today, a great collection of people with a lot of wonderful knowledge about the issue. Angie Schwartz, the Policy Director at the Alliance for Children's Rights. Susanna Niffen, the Senior Director of Child Welfare Policy at Children Now. Speaking, this is Amy Lemley at John Burton Advocates. Luciana Spidler with the Children's Law Center of California. She's their Policy Associate. And then we're really, really fortunate today to have the opportunity to hear from the people who are the most affected by the Continuum of Care and RFA. And those are caregivers. That's Lori Nolan, who's been kind enough to join us, and then Alexis Berries. Lori is a caregiver herself, and then Alexis is a former foster youth who has experience with placement with a relative and kind of some of the challenges that presented and what it means to her as a young person who's participated in the system. So I think between all these wonderful people, we're going to have a really great overview of the issue and discussion of this legislation. And so with that, let me turn it over to Susanna.
As most folks on this call probably know, CCR officially kicked off in 2015 when Governor Brown signed AB 403 into law. This initiated a comprehensive reform effort, which is known as Continuum of Care Reform. Continuum of Care Reform had several critical components or goals. The first was that all children live with a committed, permanent, and nurturing family with strong community connections. So this idea that as often as we can and whenever we can, children should be with a family and not in an institution. Other thoughts behind CCR were that in order to do this, services and support should be individualized and coordinated across systems. Children shouldn't have to move placements in order to get the services and supports that they need. So this idea that wherever a child is placed, that is the first and best person for them, and then let's make sure that we just bring the services to them rather than forcing them to move in order to get what they need to heal. When needed, congregate care should be only short-term, high quality, and an intensive intervention, which is just one part of the continuum available for children, youth, and young adults. So this idea of moving to short-term residential treatment, STRTP placements, sorry about that. So this idea that these should be short-term interventions for young people who need them, and then they should return to the family where they're cared for. The other component of CCR is effective accountability and transparency should drive continuous quality improvement for state, county, and providers. There are some key strategies related to CCR that we're starting to see roll out. They've rolled out in various stages over the last couple of years, and so folks are starting to adjust to these and to learn how to do these in their communities. One of those is child and family teams that are going to drive case planning, placement decisions, and care coordination. You may have heard these referred to as CFTs. They're beginning to roll out in varying degrees in different counties right now. There's also new licensing requirements for foster family agencies and STRTPs. Again, these make sure that they are limited short-term intervention services. There's also new approval requirements and a restructured rate system for caregivers, which provides for a single residential rate and a varied level of care home-based rate. So this idea of a child-centered rate system, rather than providing rates based on where a child lives, we're moving to a system where we determine rates based on the actual assessed needs of a child. There's also more local collaboration between child welfare, mental health, probation, and education to ensure that we're providing integrated services. So this brings us to resource family approval. And there was an amazing vision for resource family approval. This was meant to be a family-friendly, child-centered caregiver approval process. It was meant to streamline and eliminate duplication of existing processes, unify approval standards for all caregivers, preparing families to meet the needs of children in foster care, and allowing for a seamless transition to permanency. So the idea behind resource family was really, we shouldn't, again, have a fragmented system where different caregivers are approved or licensed or treated differently, that all of our young people need resource families who have gone through a similar process, have had a similar level of training, and who are ready to take care of them in the way that they need to be cared for. The timeline for implementation on CCR is a relatively long one, primarily because it's such an overhaul of our entire system. It takes a while for our systems to change. Through RFA, though, this implementation timeline focuses, it started on January 1st, 2017. So all prospective families, and this includes relatives, non-related extended family members, and more traditional foster families, all must go through the RFA process after January 1st, 2017. Next up will be current caregivers who have a child in placement at some point during 2017. Those caregivers will have until the end of 2019 to begin the RFA process.
Good morning. So I'm now going to talk a little more about the specifics of RFA, but before I get into that, I wanted to go over and clarify the differences between approval and placement, because these two sometimes get confused in the context of RFA. Approval is a process in which the child welfare agency is making sure that the caregiver can provide a safe home for a child by meeting certain criteria like RFA. And normally the funding begins when approval is granted. In contrast, placement occurs when the agency or the court places a child into a home after they do the required walkthrough and background check to confirm that it's safe. Placement can happen before approval on an emergency basis, but eventually the caregiver will have to go through the whole approval process of RFA. And during this time, they will not receive the full funding. Next slide. So the people who most likely will have a child placed before RFA approval are normally the relatives and non-related extended family members. And this is what we call traditionally kinship care. They did not anticipate caring for the children, and therefore they haven't begun the RFA process. Most of the time, it was an unplanned event, a response to like an emergency situation in which a child is detained from a parent. Maybe the aunt or grandmother gets a phone call from a social worker. They step in to provide care for the child. So now they have a child in their care, and they're dealing with everything that entails providing the care and support that this child needs while they're starting to navigate the RFA process, and they're not receiving the proper funding. These families have not prepared financially or emotionally for what is about to come. In contrast, the traditional foster care, in traditional foster care, the person has made a planned decision to become a foster caregiver. They have taken the time to go through the RFA process before having a child placed in their care, and it's not until after the process is complete and funding and services are set up so they're able to begin that the child will join their home. Next slide. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the RFA process and then go over a little more in detail. During the RFA process, the applicant will first receive an RFA orientation. Then they will have to undergo the criminal clearances and background checks. They'll undergo a home environment assessment. They will participate in 12 hours of the pre-approval training and then 8 additional hours within the first year. They will provide a health questionnaire, and sometimes they may be required to provide a full health screening by a health professional. They'll participate in a family evaluation, and this is what we used to call the psychological assessment. And all these things could be done in any order. Let me just specify that because I did say them in a particular order, but they could be going on at the same time. But at the very end, they will all receive a written report of the resource family. Next slide. So the home environment assessment is an assessment of the home and the grounds, the outdoor activity space, the storage areas of the applicant's home, and more specifically, they will look at what type of residence it is, such as is it a single-family home, an apartment, what are the available living spaces, number of bedrooms, baths, and some other relevant information, such as whether there's a pool, animals, or weapons present in the home. It also includes a criminal background check and any necessary exemptions. And finally, the total number of children in the home cannot be more than what the family can properly care for, and it shall not exceed 6 children. There is an exception for exceptional circumstances, such as if you need to place a large sibling group together. Next slide. The permanency assessment includes the verification that the applicant completed the training hours that I previously mentioned, and the family evaluation, which is a comprehensive inquiry into the applicant. And it includes the risk assessment of the applicant's motivation to become a resource family, including the relationship to the specific child or non-minor dependent that they're seeking to have in their home, the applicant's past and present experiences, and their understanding of the needs of the children in care and the ability to meet those needs. Note that the applicant's preference to provide specific level of permanency, which is whether they want to adopt or not adopt, cannot be the basis to deny the application. Next slide. And finally, some additional RFA requirements are previously mentioned: the health questionnaire, or and sometimes the screening, a first aid and CPR certification, which can be done 90 days after the approval, one face-to-face interview with all other residents in the home, including children, and this is a minimum, 2 personal references, and a DMV check on the applicant and all the adults in the home. So the RFA must be updated annually unless there's significant changes, and it must begin 60 days prior to the approval anniversary, and has to be completed no later than 30 days after. So there's very specific guidelines on when you have to redo it. Next slide. So as you may have noticed, some of the requirements I mentioned while I went over all the RFA requirements are different from what they've been in the past and from what I have mentioned in previous trainings. Because there have been so many concerns regarding the complexity and the duration of the RFA process, both from county and different stakeholders, there have been several attempts to streamline the process. The requirements I mentioned are CDSS's latest changes to the process that were released last month in Written Directives 5.0. Despite these changes, we're still seeing some very problematic systemic issues with RFA. RFA is still taking months to complete, and this is detrimental because caregivers don't receive the sufficient funds until they're approved, and funding is not retroactive to the date of placement. Thousands of existing caregivers will have to complete the conversion process. They'll have to go through the whole RFA process and get approval if they want to continue to care for the children that are already in their home. A caregiver's application can be withdrawn without any documentation of the reasons for withdrawal, forcing the caregiver to start the process all over. And permanency can be delayed in some instances because the RFA process is lengthy, so it will take a long time for the child to even get in the home. And 2, because legal guardians have to be resource families for 6 months prior to accepting guardianship to receive KINGUP funding.
So this is Angie Schwartz for the Alliance for Children's Rights, and I'm going to talk about a couple of bills that our 4 organizations are sponsoring together to try to address some of the systemic issues that Luciana was just outlining. And these bills are SB 1083 and AB 2183. Next slide. The first one I'll be talking about is SB 1083, and we are so pleased that Senator Holly Mitchell is the author of the bill. She's a champion for children and families, and she really understands the need to make sure that these programs are actually working for our families, and that any barriers that our families are encountering, especially those barriers that are prevalent because of the statute itself, need to be addressed and overcome. And that's exactly what SB 1083 will help to do. Next slide. So SB 1083, sort of an overview, is focused on clarifying those things that are causing barriers or confusions with regard to resource family approval as a result of the statute itself. I should say that we also are working very closely with the Department of Social Services on their implementing regulations. Luciana mentioned Written Directives
The written directives version 5 is out. Those are the regulations. And so we also work very closely to make sure that those regulations, which are really the detailed rules themselves, work for the families. But there are some things that have caused confusion or barriers in the statute, and that's what SB 1083 is working to overcome. So more specifically, it will require that counties complete the RFA application within 90 days for all applicants. Right now, the statute only has that 90-day requirement applying to those children that are emergency placed. What we see frequently are children that are known to someone who steps up and says, I would like this child to be placed with me, but for whatever reason, they're not initially placed in that family, so they start the resource family approval process. And because there's no time limit on how quickly the RFA process has to be complete, we have seen in our own cases families that have been separated from children that they want to be connected to for 6 and 7 and 8 months while they're working through the RFA process. So we think it's important that there actually be a timeline for all the applicants so that everyone is getting through the process in a timely manner, and those relatives and extended family members that don't have immediate placement are still able to connect to those family members on a timely basis. There's also court oversight in the case where the relatives and non-related extended family members who are seeking placement but don't have placement yet can have some review of what's going on and what the delay is. So again, if it's taking more than 90 days, giving those relatives and extended family members who are seeking placement with a specific child some remedy and someone who can actually investigate what's going on with that process. The second provision has to do with grandfathering in families who were previously approved prior to RFA. So before resource family approval came online, we had approved relatives and we had approved non-related extended family members, we had licensed foster family homes, and we had certified homes through foster family agencies. So we actually had a bunch of different ways that families came to our system and were approved, and then they would take placement of a child, and then they would be visited by a social worker every month. And so a lot of these folks who were part of our system before have not yet converted over to resource family approval. They have until the end of 2019 to convert. Counties are not actually focused very much on that conversion at this point because they're still trying to master resource family approval for all of the new families coming into our system. So there are thousands of families out there who are still caring for children, who are known to our system, who are continuing under their prior licensure or approval status. And we believe that these families should simply be grandfathered in to the resource family approval process. They're known caregivers. Lots of them have had long histories as foster parents within our system, are very well known to the counties and have been successful. And for those families, we believe that they should be grandfathered in and not have to go through additional evaluations as the law currently envisions. The third thing has to do with making sure that the court record reports the amount and source of financial support that a youth is receiving. And this is really in anticipation of the new rate system that Susanna mentioned is coming online, because now there will be new levels of care that a child might be receiving. In addition, they might be eligible for specialized care through the county. There could be infant supplements, there could be clothing allowances, and it's important for us for the attorneys to know what the children are receiving so that they can make sure that the children are receiving what they should be receiving. Next slide. A few other provisions in SB 1083. One is clarifying that when a family withdraws an RFA application, they can pick up where they left off as long as they pick up within 12 months of that withdrawal of their application. And that speaks to one of the systemic issues that Luciana talked about. We actually often see multiple families come forward at the moment that a child is removed, and then they sort of meet as a family and decide who's going to keep going on with the process. So often several of them have completed various steps, but they haven't completed the whole process. If something happens to that initial family, illness or some other emergencies that it turns out they're not going to be able to do to complete the process as they had intended, we want other family members to be able to pick up where they left off and not have to start the process all over again. We also seek to clarify that youth can continue to be placed with relative or extended family members through voluntary placement agreements, just as they have for many, many decades in California, been able to use the voluntary placement agreement process to connect children with family members on a temporary basis. So to explain VPAs a little bit, voluntary placement agreements are typically used when a county goes and investigates an allegation, gets to the home, says, yes, this is in a place where this child can stay right now, but also makes the determination that they think with some limited, time-limited supports, rehabilitation, drug treatment, that they're going to be able to connect that child back to the family. And in those instances, sometimes they offer the parent the opportunity to receive those services without having the child formally removed through a court petition, but rather that the parent agrees to have the child voluntarily placed into the home of another relative, usually, or extended family member for a period of time while they receive those services. And of course, that family member will not have been resource family approved in that moment. And the only way for VPAs to work is if they can happen in that moment. And so anything that construes a voluntary placement as having to be into a resource family effectively writes voluntary placements out of the statute altogether, which we don't want. The last thing is clarifying that those months spent with a prospective legal guardian prior to full resource family approval count towards the 6-month rule for kin gap. So to explain what that means, in order for a foster child to exit foster care into the home of a guardian and receive subsidized guardianship assistance, which we call kin gap, they have to be in the approved home of a relative for 6 months. So the approved home prior to the foster, or approved home in foster care for 6 months. So right now we have children who are coming and being placed into a relative's home. That relative is approved for placement at that moment, but those months in placement prior to approval are not counting towards the 6 months that they need in order to satisfy kin gap. And that's clearly a problem for a lot of reasons. One, if it takes 7 or 8 months to get through resource family approval and none of those months count, but in month 8, the child welfare agency is saying, well, actually, reunification is not going to work. This child's ready to exit to permanence, but now we have to keep them in foster care for an additional 6 months just so that we can have them in the resource family for 6 months. That doesn't make sense, and it actually will hurt us at the federal level when it comes to showing that we're still able to achieve timely exits to permanence. So we want to make sure that it's clear that those 8 months that they were in the home approved for placement count towards the 6-month rule in kin gap. Next slide. So we believe these things together accomplish several things. We think that we will enable children to be placed with caregivers and relatives who are known to the child faster because of the 90-day applying to all of the applications and because of that court oversight. We believe that we'll eliminate some of the unnecessary work and redundancy of approving families who already are known to our system, have a good track record. We'll be able to retain those families, not alienate them. We really risk having families leave our system if they're forced to go through an extensive conversion process. We'll make sure that there aren't delays in having children who are ready to exit to permanence be able to have that exit to permanence and not have to spend additional time in the foster care system that's not needed. Eliminate some of the confusion in navigating through the approval process and have transparency about the funding that children are receiving so we can make appropriate inquiries into whether or not that funding is appropriate. Make sure that we reduce the time that it's taking to get families through the process. So with that, I actually want to turn it over to Lori Nolan, who is a caregiver who's experienced all of this firsthand and can give us her perspective on resource family approval. Thanks, Lori.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lori Nolan. In June of 2017, DCFS placed my 5-year-old granddaughter and my 2-year-old grandson in my care. At that point, we didn't know anything about the child welfare system and what to expect. So I reached out to DCFS and I was eventually told that the process would take about 90 days. That summer, my daughter Claire and I began taking the training classes required by RFA, and at the same time we started looking for a new home. After a month of house searching, we found a home large enough that would accommodate all of us, and we moved in on August 1st. It was extremely challenging, to say the least, to finish the training hours while working full-time and moving into a new home and taking care of the kids. We did finally complete the training hours in September. And then months went by, and at this point, I had no idea what was required of me. I had no idea what the next steps were, and communication in regards to this process was very sparse. Finally, the interviews required by RFA were held in November of 2017, 6 months after my grandchildren were placed with me. And after the interviews in November, the RFA workers said they would write the report, but I didn't hear anything until January of this year. And it was definitely a challenging time with the holidays and the flu season, and I tried my best to be persistent despite all of that. The RFA process was very stressful. My daughter and I had to find a new home to meet the needs of my grandchildren while making sure they were taken care of and while working full-time. The lack of funding was most detrimental during this process. My daughter and I were under immense financial pressure. We worked full-time, which required that we find a babysitter to take care of the kids during the summer when they weren't in school. And we drained our savings completely. I borrowed from my retirement fund, and we're scraping by right now to make rent on our new home. And it's now been 9 months. Non-needy CalWorks has been helpful, but it's nowhere near the amount we need to meet the needs of the grandchildren. I had to borrow money, which has kept our heads above water, but with spring break and summer around the corner, I'm expecting another financial hit on our budget. So on top of the emotional upheaval we've gone through, the lack of funding has made our lives that much more challenging, and there's so much more to have to worry about. Everything in the last 9 months has turned my life upside down, but I would care for my grandchildren no matter what. I'd do it all over again. Overall, I find the lack of funding very troubling. We're all in this to help the children that need it the most, but this process is so incredibly draining, and I don't understand why it has to be this way. So I hope necessary changes are made soon so families can focus on those who need the most support, and that's our children. So thank you so much for listening to my story.
Thank you so much, Lori. That's a perfect segue to our next bill, AB 2183, authored by Assemblymember Blanca Rubio, who is another champion of our foster youth. She's also the chair of the Assembly Human Services Committee and a member of the Assembly Committee on Budget. So she is on key committees for the bills that we are talking about on today's webinar. Next slide. And specifically, this bill is about what Lori was just talking about. It's about making sure that our families that step up and take emergency placement prior to being approved are supported through that process. Of course, we want, as Luciana said at the beginning, our relatives and extended family members come through a different door for foster care, and we want them to come through that door. At the moment that we're removing a child from their home, our first priority is to find someone known to that child so that we can reduce the trauma they experience from the removal, so that we can stabilize them and connect them to someone who they know, who they feel safe and secure with as quickly as possible. And in those moments when we do that very thing that is best for children, we are not placing that child into a home that's been approved. None of those families have anticipated being resource family approval, so they're doing everything backwards, and they're doing the approval after they accept the placement of the child into their home. And because resource family approval is taking so long, now they're going months and months, and in the case of Lori, 9 months, 10 months, without any funding or services for these children. So AB 2183 requires counties to secure that short-term funding either through the ARC program, which stands for the Approved Relative Caregiver Program, or the Emergency Assistance Program. And the reason we focused on those two programs is because they're both already available. ARC for relatives, emergency assistance for non-related extended family members at the foster care rate. So it's equal to the amount already paid at the foster care rate, and it can be paid. EA is available for up to 12 months. ARC doesn't have a time limit on it. So it's something that counties already know how to use and administer, and we can make sure we get immediate funding to these families. AB 2183 also allows counties to waive non-safety and health requirements on a case-by-case basis based on extraordinary circumstances. This is actually existing federal law, and it's just clarifying in our own state law that counties have that ability to sort of expedite the process on a case-by-case basis and in extraordinary circumstances in order to achieve that approval faster, specifically in these cases where the caregiver has already accepted placement into the home. And the third thing it would do is clarify that school of origin funding can also be initiated at the point of placement, regardless of whether or not they've actually been approved as a resource family. And again, that's because if you don't initiate the school of origin funding immediately, the youth effectively loses the right to remain in their school of origin. That is a decision that is made upon placement. And if the funding isn't there to enable the caregiver to transport the child, and they don't have the ability to do so without that support, they're going to be forced to have the child change schools, which again, we don't want. That undermines the stability and the success of that child and potentially that placement. So we don't want that. Next slide. So the issues that 2183 is helping to fix are the very ones that Lori was just talking about so eloquently. It's really making sure that our families have that support at the moment that they take a child into their home, which of course just makes logical sense. At the moment that you take a child into your home, that child starts to need resources, they start eating, they need to be clothed, they need to be able to get to their school of origin, they need all of these things. In fact, it's those first few months after placement that are the most critical in making sure that our families have support and services in order to stabilize that placement and stabilize that child. And so this is just making sure that that funding and those supports are immediately available, which we think will help to reduce placement disruptions, will ease the financial stress that our families, which Lori spoke to very well, are currently experiencing, and also enable our families who want to step up and provide the support to children that they know and care for and love. Next step. Slide. So I should say that there may be short-term relief for families available through the end of this fiscal year. Both the Assembly and Senate Budget Committees recently approved two different urgency measures, which are identical, AB 110 and SB 120. I expect that they'll be voted on by the full Assembly and Senate today. And if one of these bills is signed into law, the families who currently have placements prior to approval will begin to be able to receive funding equal to the basic foster care rate as soon as the Department of Social Services releases an all-county letter, which we hope that they can do very quickly after the bill is signed into law. And the reason it will be available immediately is because the bills are urgency measures, and urgency bills take effect upon the signature of the governor. And so these bills specifically say that once the department releases that all-county letter, families that are currently in this limbo will begin to receive support equal to the basic foster care rate through June 30th, 2018. And then those families that come into our system because a child is removed and they step up, and it's after the date that the all-county letter has been signed, they would receive payment as of the date of that placement. So this is providing some short-term relief for families that are currently in this limbo that Lori described, and the families that come into the system between now and June 30th, 2018, to make sure that they receive support. It only is through June 30th of 2018, only if the bill is actually signed into law. So this is not a certain fix at this point. We don't know for certain that this is going to happen. And again, it would only solve the problem through June 30th of 2018. The legislature needs to enact further legislation in order to continue support beyond June 30th, 2018. And, you know, everyone is aware of the need for the longer term solution, but there has been consensus that they want to work out what that longer term solution is through the normal budget process and bill process that we're in the middle of right now. So that's what's going on in terms of a potential short-term relief for some of our families through the rest of this fiscal year. Next slide. So I just want to turn it over to Alexis, who can give the experience of youth themselves who have been experiencing resource family approval. Alexis?
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Alexis Berries, youth advocate. I spent a total of 18 years in the foster care system after both of my parents became incarcerated facing life sentences. Because reunification was not an option, finding permanency was the goal. Unfortunately, the goal for me was not met because of a number of issues. So permanency for me could have been met specifically if my presence in the home didn't become a financial burden. I was placed with my older sibling who already had a young child when I was a teenager. As we all know, teenagers can be pretty expensive. While I was in the care of my sister for over a year, she didn't receive any payments to help support me. I knew that she was doing the best that she could by exhausting all her resources and incurring debt just to support me. She took out loans, credit cards, and other financial debt that I've confirmed till this day she's still in. I actually remember it being so bad that I used to go to the mall and steal clothes because I didn't want to have to wear the same clothes to school and be made fun of. It was mentally challenging and very degrading. Me having to steal my own clothes and hygiene products only led to me getting in trouble. Had payment begun at the time of placement, it wouldn't have put such a financial constraint on my caregiver, and ultimately I could have met permanency. Because my main goal is to help reform foster care for those still experiencing it, I'm in full support of the proposed legislation to grandfather existing caregivers in and have our youth go from families to facilities, and of course having payment at the time of placement. Although the odds did not work out in my favor, we can do better for our existing children. I would like to see all children in care experience stability, and with the proposed legislation, I feel like it gets us one step closer and it puts actions behind our words.
Thank you very much, Alexis, for sharing that. And I think you raise a really important point, is that this stress isn't limited to the caregiver. 1 in 4 young people in care is age 16 or older, and certainly by then and even younger, a young person is feeling that financial strain. So thanks for sharing that and just giving us a perspective of a young person who wanted to live with a relative caregiver and wasn't able to. So we really appreciate you being on today's web seminar. From here, we're going to move to talk a little bit about the legislation. These are what we believe are common sense fixes that are going to enable CCR and specifically the RFA process to realize their full potential. When the promise was made regarding these reform proposals, I think that we all envisioned this kind of access to resources to support the most vulnerable children. But they face considerable challenges. There are many worthy competing priorities in the legislature currently. And then as an urgency bill, AB 2183 does require a 2/3 vote for passage. And so, while we all agree that these improvements, or many of us agree, are a good idea, they're not going to happen absent some very active engagement. And that's really what we need. Again, whether you're a young person, a social worker, a probation officer, a other type of public official, everyone can play some small role. And that includes partnering with us to tell us why you don't agree with us. But let's all engage together to find the solution that's going to ensure that caregivers move through this process in an expedited fashion and get the resources to care for children. We all share that interest. And so that's kind of what I'm going to lay out here next is, here's the timeline for these proposals to move through the legislature. On the top, you can see SB 1083. At this point, it has been set for Senate Human Services on April 10th. And as you can see from there, it will move through the process over the spring, hopefully, and then if approved by the legislature, move on to the governor. On the lower level, you see AB 2183, which will follow a similar pattern starting in the Assembly, hopefully moving over to the Senate. And each step of the way, we need to make the case to our elected officials and other stakeholders that this is a priority. There's 80 members of the Assembly, 40 members of the Senate, all of them have 20 bills or so. There's no lack of things to think about and care about, and yet we're working to try and take these two bills to the very top of the priority list. And no four organizations are going to do that alone. It's going to take an army of people to achieve that. At the same time, there's a parallel budget process, as Angie mentioned. That started when the governor released his proposed budget in January. And that conversation, as you can see, really happens between now and June 15th, when the legislature will finalize its budget and move on to the governor. The first thing, kind of formal way to engage in that process is the Senate and Assembly budget hearings, which are going to be held on April 11th and 12th. And that's going to be a great opportunity for a public discourse. Again, if we share the same goal, which I don't think I've ever talked to anyone who doesn't want to see vulnerable children well supported by families, but it's a chance to hash out the solutions and a chance to propose this, raise the issues we're talking about today, and press for change sooner rather than later. And so there's lots of ways that you can engage in both the legislative process and the budget process. The first one is simply to send in a support letter for both pieces of legislation. And when you all get this following the web seminar, you will have links to sample support letters. But this is a way, people say, do letters really matter? Who really reads them? They do matter. They are listed in the committee analysis. And they're important. They're an important way to say that this isn't just some idea that someone pulled out of somewhere, but that there's a strong base of community support. So please take the time to download those, customize them slightly if you have the time to, print them on your letterhead and forward them in following the instructions on the sample support letters. Secondly, the committee hearings are mission critical, and each of you are going to receive a link where if you're able to attend the April budget committee hearings, we would strongly encourage you to RSVP. Now, if you are a caregiver or a young person, we really, we want everyone, but we're really seeking to draw those voices out because they bring such a powerful kind of perspective to the conversation. We do have limited funding for transportation, and because the hearings are back-to-back, we are going to be booking a block of rooms. And so if you say, I've got the time, I'm willing to come up, we will, for a limited number of people, unfortunately, we can't do it for too many, able to offer support for you to stay overnight. And so this can be a really powerful way to come and speak your truth, share your experience, and help people who want to improve foster care know the challenges you're experiencing. If you can't travel, fortunately, we have legislators all around the state, and we are going to be working on a strategy to connect different folks with their legislators in the district. Often you can have longer, richer conversations with actual electeds in your district because perhaps over spring break, because they're there. In the Capitol, it's, every 15 minutes, ding, 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 ding. But these people are representing your communities. They care about the people who put them into office, and they want to know about your experience. So if you think you might have time to go to meet one of your legislators or their representatives, we'll help connect you with the person in the district. Also encouraging foster youth and caregivers to get involved. You're working at the most applied level. You're actually serving the young people. And sometimes you might think, wow, and now I've got to help pass bills too. If you do have the time and the capacity, it means a tremendous amount. And we ask it understanding you have many, many competing priorities, but it's something to consider. If you're someone who works for an association or organization that interfaces with foster youth or caregivers, simply passing along information to them would be really appreciated. And then last but not least is just stay tuned. We're very encouraged by the short-term relief that Angie mentioned. That is movement in the right direction. And to me, as a glass half full person, that sounds to me like there is the will to make a fix. So let's go in with our ideas of what that fix is and turn that into the solution moving forward. So from here, we're going to jump in and have a Q&A session. There were a lot of really good questions submitted, and I'm going to move through those. What I'll do is I'm going to ask a question, and I will direct it to the person who kind of covered that in the presentation. Of course, if any of the other presenters want to chime in, you certainly can, but I think we'll get through the most questions if we try to stay focused. So the first one, Angie, is for you. It is SB 1083. This seems like it might clog up the RFA social workers who are trying to approve the RFA application for the family member who might be higher priority because the child has been placed there on an emergency basis. Could you address this?
Sure. So we are not trying to clog up the system anymore, and actually I think most of the unclogging of resource family approval is being done through the written directives and the state's work to try to expedite and streamline some of the actual rules that govern RFA. But it is our belief that we still need to make sure that there are timelines running for all of the family members, relatives and extended family members who are entering the system and submitting that resource family approval application for the purpose of being connected to a specific child. And I would say in those instances where they are connected at that first moment and placed prior to approval, it's important to get the families through the process quickly, especially right now when there's no funding. But it is our hope that there will be a long-term solution and families will be funded through that process. It is equally important that those people that are stepping up and making that application because they know a child and are trying to get connected to that specific child also get through the process quickly, because every month that goes by is months that those children are not connected to someone who's known to them and who loves them. We have a grandmother right now, just to give a specific example, who stepped up, wants to be the placement for the children. For whatever reason, the county didn't initially place. Instead, they placed the children with strangers 4 hours away from her. So now she's having to drive 8 hours round trip in order to visit her grandchildren while she tries to get through the approval process, which is taking much longer than it should. And we don't want children to be separated from their grandparents in situations like that either.
Thanks, Angie. This, Luciana, if I could direct this to you, will the grandfathering apply to FFA certified homes?
Will the grandfather, I mean, it should, it's not, the language of the bill doesn't specify FFA or relative placement.
Okay, thanks. This one is a suggestion. Angie, if you want to reflect on it, can the bill clarify that voluntary placements can be made through WIC 361.4 assessment? Currently, the bill doesn't say that, and it would be good to have standards for voluntary placements. Any thoughts or reflections on that? Was that something that was considered?
Yeah. That actually is our intention, and I think there's part of the bill, and I can't remember the section or the statutory section that it's in. It's like the 16,000 of the Welfare and Institutions Code that's amended that ties it to the 361.4 assessment. So I actually think that is in there, and if it's not, it should be.
Okay, well, thank you for the technical assistance. So the next question is, Luciana, I'll ask you. So ARC will no longer require relatives to be approved. Is that correct?
ARC will not, I guess actually, Angie, this might be a better question for you with the funding, because I'm trying to go over it in my head. Angie, will you take this one?
So ARC would be allowed to be initiated at the point of placement, which is again following that 361.4 assessment. And for our folks on the phone who don't know what that means, a 361.4 assessment means there's been a criminal background check, that there's been an inspection of the home, there's obviously been a conversation with the family, so you're still making sure that this is a safe place to leave the child, that the home meets health and safety standards, that the caregiver is an adequate caregiver. It's just something that can be done pretty quickly, usually in 24 to 48 hours. You can do the things required by a 361.4 assessment. And so at that point, they would be approved for purposes of receiving ARC funding, but then they would still have to go through the resource family approval process. So it does not exempt them from that process whatsoever. It just allows ARC to start funding at that moment of placement when they meet the 361.4 requirements, and then would require them to still get through the entirety of the resource family approval process.
Thank you. Here's another piece of guidance or technical assistance for us. Is it possible to consider extending the date to approve current foster parents instead of grandfathering in? There are marginal foster parents out there that counties do not use due to concerns, but the licensure is not removed. Some social workers are concerned this minimizes the care for foster children and grandfathers in inappropriate caregivers. Any thoughts or reflections from any of the sponsor organizations on that?
So this is Angie. We've started to have these conversations as a co-sponsor group in terms of just sort of making sure that there is the discretion to grandfather in, but really giving some ability and some guidance to the individuals that would qualify to be grandfathered in, but thinking about like how to make sure that we're not grandfathering in folks that would be inappropriate to grandfather in. So yes, we've started having those discussions.
Great, thank you. Will ETR be fundable through emergency assistance or ARC? Angie, do you want to take that one?
What's ETR?
You know, I assumed you would know when there's an acronym. You're the one. So if the person who put that in,
that acronym.
Well, we'll move on. Well, here's one you definitely do know, and this is an actual question. Oh, educational transportation reimbursement. Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay, what was the question again?
Will education transportation reimbursement be fundable through emergency assistance or ARC?
That's a good question, and the bill at this point doesn't specify which, but I would imagine it would be those two. But no, it does. There's not a specific allocation at this point in terms of where it would come from.
Mm-hmm. So this is maybe a point of clarification, something, and then also a question. It says when a family withdraws an application, they can pick up where they left off within 12 months of withdrawal. How does this impact the 90-day from application deadline? Do you kind of know what she's getting at here, Angie?
So it's not my understanding that the statute currently allows for a family to pick up where they left off as long as it's within 12 months of withdrawing their application. And so we're seeking to make that clarification in statute because that isn't the experience that our families are having in all counties. And maybe it is how it's playing out in some counties, I'm not sure.
And Angie, I don't know if this answers the question, but it's not specified in our language what would happen with the 90-day timeline, but it could be something as when they come back and pick up again 90 days from there, but that's not specified.
Okay, thank you. Here's another acronym question, but again, I think you can slam dunk this one, Angie. What does ARC stand for?
ARC is the Approved Relative Caregiver Program. So for our relatives who are caring for children who are not federally eligible, they don't receive AFDC-FC, which is the acronym for foster care payments that the vast majority of foster homes receive. Instead, the relatives receive ARC. I won't get into the reasons that relatives have a different program. I will just say that ARC and AFDC-FC are in every way identical to one another. It's the same rates. They qualify for specialized care, clothing allowance. The two programs are identical to one another. But some of our relatives receive ARC, and some of our relatives who are caring for federally eligible children receive AFDC-FC.
Thank you. Luciana, this is on the background of RFA requirements. In your presentation, you mentioned that or it could have been Susanna, I'm not sure, that RFA must be updated annually or more if there are significant changes. What does RFA being updated mean?
There are portions that have to be updated, and all the specifics of it are in the RIN directives, which are the regulations. There's some things that don't require updates, but others that do, including having to do the 8 hours of additional training every year. But for the very specifics of it is the most current RIN directives.
I see. So kind of certain elements of it. All right, This one's for you, Angie. What is the Emergency Assistance Program?
Sorry, I was on mute. The Emergency Assistance Program is a program that's been in existence in California since the 90s. It is a program that is funded through TANF now, used to be funded, which is our Temporary Aid to Needy Families program. which was enacted in 1996. It allows counties to, at the point of removal and placement into a non-relative extended family member's home, to start using EA to fund that placement, as opposed to using the AFDC-FC funds for that placement. EA can continue for 12 months. So it is funding to stabilize that home immediately, while AFDC-FC is pending and actually can be paid for the entire first 12 months of placement into that non-relative's home.
Thank you very much. Oh, yeah, definitely. So another question, is there a deadline for RFA to be completed for current caregivers?
Yes, for those children that for those caregivers that accept placement prior to approval, there's the 90-day timeline for them. But if they don't get that placement in that moment, then there's no timeline running, even if there's a child that they know that they're trying to get connected to. And that's what our bill would fix.
Well, and maybe Luciana, do you want to add?
Sorry, no, I wasn't sure if it referred to the conversion when they have to convert by, if they already have a child in their home that had been placed there already, and that would be, they have to have started the process by the end of this year.
Okay. Well, great. Well, those are really all of our questions. Thank you, everyone. Would any of the presenters like to add anything before we wrap up? Okay. Well, if not, I just want to again thank everyone who attended today. We will send out the presentation, a recording of it, and any other materials that we referenced, including the links for the April 11th and 12th Budget Committee and the sample support letters for both bills. And really urge you to send those in and follow up with any additional, suggestions or feedback, because again, we're a long way from this being a done deal, and we're absolutely open to hearing your thoughts and your concerns and your ideas to make these proposals as strong as possible. So I think with that, we will conclude today's web seminar.